Hello, my name is John Roskam. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and welcome to this episode of IPA Encounters with Heather McDonald. Heather is one of the strongest and most influential opponents of identity politics and critical race theory in the United States, and she's a passionate advocate for freedom of ideas, for our history and for our culture and what it means to be human. In Heather's book, The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Are Pandering to Universities and Undermine Our Culture, which was a New York bestseller, Heather talks about how the rush for diversity is in fact hurting those who it should be seeking to help. I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson and Charles Murray, and this is what Jordan Peterson said about the diversity delusion. Why should we care what happens in the ivory tower? Because what happens there very soon happens everywhere. Heather McDonald warns us, the universities have been transformed into factories of ideology that mass produce victims, certain in their oppression, searching everywhere for oppressors to blame and to punish. And the ranks of those deemed tyrants and prosecutors threaten to swell until every single one of us is deemed guilty in some manner or another. Beware. And this is from Charles Murray. Others besides Heather McDonald have indicted academia for devastating liberal education, but no one has ever documented the damage as McDonald does in The Diversity Delusion. It is crammed with facts and numbers that universities go to great lengths to hide. How she did it is a mystery, but The Diversity Delusion will be my master reference for anything I write on these topics. Today we'll be talking about what has happened to our culture, why it has happened, and what we do about it. In particular, we'll be talking about an area of great interest and import to IPA members, our schools and universities. I'm speaking to you at the moment live from the Baillieu Media Studio here in Melbourne, and Heather is speaking to us from her home in Los Angeles. Dozens of IPA members have sent in questions, and we, in the hour that we have today, will try and get through as many of those questions as possible. Now, before we hear from Heather, let me say a few more words about Heather McDonald. Heather is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal, and, as I mentioned, a New York Times best-selling author. She is the recipient of the 2005 Bradley Prize. McDonald's work at City Journal has covered a range of topics, including higher education, immigration, policing, homelessness, homeless advocacy, criminal justice reform, and race relations. Heather's writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and many other outlets. As I mentioned, Heather's most recent book, The Diversity Delusion, argues that toxic ideas that were first spread in universities and propagated in colleges of higher education are now fueling intolerance and have in fact widened divisions in our society. Her book, The War on Cops in 2016, was also a New York Times bestseller, and it warned about what we are seeing now, that race-based attacks on the criminal justice system divide society and again hurt those who so many policies have been attempting to help. Heather is a frequent guest on Fox News and on many other programs. Heather holds a BA in English from Yale University, and she graduated with a Merton Fellowship to Cambridge University, where she earned an MA in English. She studied in Italy, and she holds a law degree from Stanford University Law School. Heather, welcome. Thank you for being with us today on IPA Encounters.
John, it's a real honor to be at Institute of Public Affairs, and I follow your work, and you're doing absolutely the most essential work to try to preserve sanity and freedom in Australia. So thank you for having me with you.
Heather, Can I begin by quoting something you wrote last year when you were talking about the humanities and the liberal arts? And towards the end of that piece, you cut to the heart of the issue that so many of us are thinking about here in Australia, and I know you are thinking about in the United States. And I'll quote some of what you say. You wrote, "We are in uncharted territory. How a civilization survives with so much contempt for itself is an open question. The greatest sin of the social justice and diversity crusade warriors is to teach students to hate their cultural inheritance. The social justice crusaders are stripping the future of everything that gives human life meaning, beauty, sublimity, and wit." Can you talk about what you meant by those powerful words, Heather?
Well, students are being taught to hate. They're being taught to hate each other. They're being taught to hate the extraordinary accomplishments of Western civilization. And educators, so-called, are absolutely complicit. They are driving this profound betrayal of what education is supposed to be. As the great British philosopher Michael Oakeshott said, school is where one generation passes on an inheritance to the next. And now we are wallowing in ignorance. Students learn nothing about the past that is actually honest. They do not learn what is one of the most essential elements of human life, which is gratitude. We should be down on our knees in front of these great works of imagination, of intellect, of rationality that is our supreme unmerited good fortune to have inherited. And instead, teachers are telling students to be angry and, most preposterously, to think of themselves as victims. As I try to tell students, provoking absolute fits of hysteria and lachrymose self-pity, there is no individual in human history more privileged today than a college student, whether it's in Australia or in the United States, because every college student has at his fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for, which is knowledge. And yet universities now are dedicated not to knowledge, but to inculcating in students their current status on the great totem pole of victimhood, where there's a vicious competition among different identity-based groups to be the top dog victim. These days, it seems maybe trans students occupy that, but it's a very internecine war among the various groups. Sometimes blacks win out, other times females, other times trans. And that is what the main goal of universities are, is to understand that you're either the oppressed or the oppressor.
And Heather, there's so much in what you just said that I'd like to discuss with you over the next hour. Can I begin by asking you, how has this happened? One of the great strengths of the diversity delusion is that you trace what's occurring back to the 70s and back to the 80s. I think so many people now are shocked when we are told that mathematics is not about the correct result, it's about how you feel. But in fact, these trends have been going back decades. What started happening in the 60s and 70s and 80s that has given rise to this?
Well, John, I'm going to speak from my own experience here. When I speak on college campuses, the dominating idea is that of race. In the pre-pandemic world, it's hard to remember, I gave sort of back-to-back speeches at Holy Cross University, which is a small Catholic liberal arts college in Massachusetts, and at Bucknell University, which is in Pennsylvania. At Holy Cross, about 15 minutes into my speech, when I was talking about Petrarch and the Renaissance humanists and their fierce canine appetite for learning, a bunch of Black students got up and started chanting, my oppression is not a delusion. My oppression is not a delusion, because I was telling them and every other Holy Cross student, again, that they were supremely fortunate and should be grateful for the resources available to them. They viewed me as a threat to their racial identity and were insistent on holding on to their idea, the idea that as Black students, they were literally at risk of their lives. At Bucknell, there was a whole bunch of organizing that went on before my talk to try to protect students from the trauma that my very presence on campus would cause. There was a session for self-healing where the students painted self-care rocks, an exercise that was initially designed for K through 5 students, kindergarten through 5th grade. I don't know what your counterparts are in Australia. And a student afterwards said something quite accurate, actually, in spite of himself, which was that my main sin was to try to start a very elementary conversation about whether systemic racism even exists. So let me say that in my experience, racial issues are driving this. And what is driving racial issues on campus is something that's very difficult to talk about. And I always hesitate to broach the topic, but it is driving virtually everything, I think, in Western societies today, which is the academic skills gap, the behavior skills gap, and the folly in universities and other institutions of racial preferences. Here's the situation in at least American campuses today, John. There's not a single selective American college that does not practice massive racial preferences, meaning that each campus, in order to achieve what it views as a necessary complement of Black students, is admitting Black students with objective academic qualifications that are at least a standard deviation below that of their white and Asian peers. In the United States, there are very large academic skills gap. The average Black 8th grader reads at the level of the average white 8th grader. I'm sorry, average Black 12th grader, that is a 18-year-old Black student reads at the level of a 13 or 14-year-old white student. Those gaps never close. 54% of Black 8th graders, that is 13-year-old Black students, do not even possess partial mastery of math skills expected for that age cohort. So what goes on in a college campus is you're bringing, and at Google and at high-tech law firms, at banks, at institutions, is these preening elites so desperate to look out with noblesse oblige upon their diverse student body or workforce, put Blacks at a massive competitive disadvantage. If I were admitted to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, our premier STEM high-tech school, with a gender quota, because MIT decides it needs to have more females engineers, and it admitted me with math scores that were a standard deviation below those of my peers, my male peers who had been admitted on merit rather than on the triviality of gonads, I would have a very hard time keeping up. In my freshman year calculus course, in my first year calculus course, I would struggle to keep up. I may drop out, certainly of a science track, if not out of the school entirely. And I would face two options. I could blame my problems on the fact that I was admitted with greatly lower academic qualifications as my peers, or I could say that I was a victim of rape culture. And I was surrounded at every turn by misogynists who wanted to keep females down, notwithstanding the fact that the only reason I'm there is because they're so desperate to admit females. The same goes for Black students. They are encouraged to, they experience huge academic difficulties. They're encouraged to think of themselves as victims of circumambient racism, even though the reason that they are at any given college catapulted above their academic preparation is because the school is so desperate to have them there. This problem of the academic skills gap and the behavior gap, I might say, which is what I addressed in War on Cops, I think is driving a huge amount of elite bad ideas and bad thinking today.
Is it, Heather, these social outcomes, as you've elaborated, driving some of this, or is some of this political? Do the roots of what's happening go back to before the 1980s and 1990s? Is there something in our political culture that has given rise to the idea that students should now no longer be strong but should be victims?
Well, the race issue begins in the 1960s when you had schools after school starting to practice what we call affirmative action or racial preferences. And then in the 80s, you had females sort of grabbing the coattails of Black activist groups and claiming that they deserved special preferences and that they were victims. I mean, a lot of the hatred for knowledge and the elevation of ignorance, one can see some traces of our culture in the 1950s with the stupendous success of capitalism and its generation of prosperity that for the first time in human history anywhere put spending power in the hands of ignorant adolescents who could use their parents' credit cards, and you had corporations eager to tap into this new market and start to glorify youth culture, which again is a very perverse thing in human history. And you had adolescent tastes starting to dictate culture at large. So that's part of what's going on. But the assault on our traditions really began, on our intellectual traditions, began in earnest in the 1980s. I feel fortunate because I was in college in the 70s, and though I was seduced by what I now regard as a very perverse form of high, insane literary theory known as deconstruction, fantastically in the 1970s, I was still permitted the luxury of reading Milton and William Wordsworth and Edmund Spencer without once thinking to complain that I was reading somebody of the wrong race and sex. So that the obsession with race and gender victimhood didn't start up until the 1980s. And why that was exactly, I can't say, but the racial bad faith of colleges had grown worse over the ensuing decade, and now is just in a state of complete insanity. And it's spreading. It has spread. I mean, it's now present in every mainstream institution in the United States.
You mentioned your educational background. Could you talk a little bit about that? You're passionate about English, about music, about art, and you're uniquely equipped to understand and explain to us how deconstruction and theories of postmodernism had a role and might not have had a role in what is occurring. Can you talk a little bit about your college experience and what you studied and how you've come to some of the conclusions that you have at the moment?
Well, John, I'm reluctant to do so because I don't think that your listeners or viewers and members are going to be able to suspend disbelief to an adequate degree to fathom how I or anybody else could have been so idiotic as to be taken in by these theories, because their propositions are patently absurd and counterfactual. And yet I came to college with a fascination with language. At that point, I loved novels that were the most sort of pressing the boundaries of conventional language the most, whether it's William Faulkner or Virginia Woolf, or even Melville, who writes in a very ecstatic manner. But I found questions of interpretation, of how we use language to be very fascinating. And at the time, the hottest theory going to talk about these questions of interpretation and how we read text and what language is, was something that goes variously under the names of deconstruction or post-structuralism. And now I'm going to enter again the realm of the fantastical. Deconstruction held that there was really no such thing as human beings, that was all language, that we are simply epiphenomena of language, and that all literature is about itself. It's self-referential, and not only is it about itself, it's about its own failures. Now, again, please understand, I am not subscribing to these theses today. I don't understand how I could have been so stupid, but I wasted vast amounts of time in the library stacks poring over the turgid and highly mannered tomes of Jacques Derrida and Paul de Man, reaching back to Martin Heidegger, who arguably maybe has a little bit more legitimacy than Derrida, who I regard as 100% of a fraudster. Some of my conservative faculty colleagues disagree with me on that, but I think they've simply sipped at the Kool-Aid, if not drunk it entirely. So, as I say, though, it was a Mandarin science. As lunatic as Paul de Man was, with his obsession with images of mutilation and massacre in Shelley's poetry, he read, and Jacques Derrida read Proust. They read Plato. They read Aristotle without, again, it's very weird to think about it now, thinking to complain that these are dead white males. So I got out of Yale still blinded by these theories, thinking that it had a certain dangerous cult quality to it, where we understood the secret knowledge that language broke down, that human beings were mere rhetorical tropes, whereas other people were actually reading novels to understand human experience, which is now what I look for. I look for both beauty of language, for the possibility of using language in ways that none of us are capable of, was Max Beerbohm, Milton's descriptions of paradise, luscious, rich, erotic uses of language. But I also look for human insight, and I'm astounded by what George Eliot can tell us about the difficulties of human communication in Middlemarch, what she understands about how we blind ourselves to the realities of the person we anticipate marrying, creating images that we think will most satisfy our own egos. All of this is astounding insight. Back then, though, I only thought of literature as about tropes and issues of representation. So I came out of there. I went to Cambridge. I started studying linguistics. It gradually dawned on me that what I had spent so much time on at Yale and doing deconstruction, post-structuralism, was all ridiculous. And these people knew nothing about language. And at that point, I sort of wanted to wreak revenge on these people that had meant that I'd not spend enough time reading 18th century novels and instead was reading the likes of Julia Kristeva. So I started writing at that point, slowly, about multiculturalism, about postmodernism, in trying to understand where their errors were, to warn others against them. At that point, it was way too late. They had taken over the entire academy, reduced the great study of the humanities to an exercise of narcissism, of self-regarding, self-pity. Students now want to only navel gaze. And as I say, the main theme in humanities today is victimhood and oppression. Whereas the role of the humanities is to take ourselves, we are petty, we are narrow, we are ignorant, we are bounded by our puny minds. But Rabelais or Ben Jonson or Petrarch can take us out of ourselves into worlds that are vastly larger than our own. That's what the humanities should be about. Today, they are the exact opposite of that. And I find that tragic.
And Heather, you have spoken and written beautifully about exactly as you've just said, the humanities taking us out of ourselves. We see a different perspective regardless of what our race or gender or class is. And so this is a segue into what I would like to talk to you about now, which is the episode at the Juilliard School in New York. Now, some of the people watching today will be familiar with what occurred. Some won't be. So I'll ask you to explain what occurred and what it meant. But before I do that, I'm going to quote to you something you wrote about the episode, which goes to exactly what you are saying, which is the students at the school, by only wanting to talk about their own experience, then we're attempting to create barriers and be gatekeepers around historical truths. You wrote, favoured victim groups could expound on the history at will, but others would need to earn permission if they were of a different race or gender or class. And then you said, and this is important about truth, it matters not that any given historical presentation is accurate. It may enter the public arena only if it does not offend the feelings of those who claim to be oppressed by its recollection. And then you made the key point, when it comes to race, subjective truth is now the only allowable truth. Can you talk about what happened at Juilliard and what it means? Because it's symptomatic of many, many other instances of similar things.
Absolutely, John. And this falls under the broad category of cultural appropriation, which has got to be the stupidest idea that anybody has ever come up with in the realm of culture. I mean, it's just mind-blowing, the pettiness of the cultural appropriation ideal. But Juilliard School in New York is most known as a music conservatory. It also has a dance division and a theater division. And like every arts institution, above all music institution, and I've got a huge piece coming out any moment now in City Journal on the Black Lives Matter attack on classical music, which is the thing that is closest to my heart. Juilliard is right now in a state of meltdown over its own phantom systemic racism. This is true of every orchestra in the country. It is true of every theater group. They are all on bended knee before Black Lives Matter. So Juilliard has, since the race riots of the summer of 2020, has been bulking up on its diversity bureaucracy, on its apologies for non-existent racism. And it brought in, last September, it was going to introduce its drama students to a 3-day workshop on the role of Black music in American culture, a perfectly legitimate and important topic. And one of the presenters in this 3-day workshop was one of Juilliard's outside consultants on diversity, otherwise known as EDIB issues, which is one of the acronyms, equity, diversity, inclusion, and now we've got B, which is belonging. So if you don't have your B on and you're an institution, you're missing out, guys. So they brought in this professor from another local New York City college, Hunter College, Michael McElroy, to give a presentation on Black musical culture, musical theater. McElroy is Black himself. The first day of the workshop was on the American spiritual, which McElroy's argument was grew out of the slavery experience. And so to bring these drama students, whose very goal is to engage in imaginative recreation of other people's lives and of the past and of history, were watching on Zoom an audio recreation of the African slave trade. And there was sounds, you could hear people tramping through the jungle. And then there was a slave auction whose dialogue was taken from the 1980s miniseries, or maybe it's 1970s, miniseries Roots, written by the Black author Alex Haley. And so the students were participating somehow in this slave auction. Well, the Black students on the Zoom call, most of them, not all of them, absolutely freaked out at this. They viewed it as a insupportable assault on their racial identity. They viewed it as lethal, as something that they could barely survive, to have to listen to a dramatic recreation of the slave trade. And notwithstanding, again, the fact that this was something that was being produced by a Black dramatist himself, this Michael McElroy. So they went on a warpath. One of the Black students made a video tearfully about how psychologically lethal this was to students. The Juilliard administration and faculty went into complete capitulation mode. They basically fired McElroy. They ended the workshop. They apologized. They groveled just excruciatingly about how they never, ever should have thought of doing this, and would they ever earn the right of respect from their Black students again. And the head of the school apologized. The head of the drama division apologized. The Black students continued to wield their power and demand further and further reparations. They issued a set of demands saying that Juilliard should not even think about teaching students the general American dialect. It should respect ethnic identities in all casting. Blacks should not have to play any role outside of their own chosen racial identity unless they had absolutely agreed to do this. Naturally, white students should never be allowed to play a Black student. What you have going up is razor wire and army military barricades around imaginative freedom.
What does this mean for art, Heather? If you can't play a character, or if you can't write about something that you are not. George Eliot would never have been able to write about men.
There's nothing like it. I've recently read a book called The Slaves of Solitude by a British author, Hamilton, which was set in the World War II at a sort of tacky British boarding house. His insight into female sexual rivalry was just stunning. Now, if I follow the dictates of the cultural appropriation, he should never have been able to do that. He cannot appropriate a female sexual identity. The greatness of human beings is that they're not bound by their own individual consciousness. Frederick Douglass, spoke of the inspiration he received reading white members of parliament speaking on slavery. W.E. Du Bois spoke about the being able to walk arm in arm with Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul he will, and they come with no scorn nor condescension. Ralph Ellison spoke about being taken out of his own narrow identity in Mason, Georgia, by reading Virginia Woolf and Ernest Hemingway and other great writers of the early 20th century, without thinking that he could not experience what white writers thought, or as whites, they couldn't experience what he as a Black man thought. We are now crippling human imagination, and with it, the very possibility of freedom.
Do you think these contradictions of cultural appropriation are starting to become apparent? Or do we still have a little way to go and it might get worse before it gets better?
It's getting worse. I'm writing right now about a production of Nixon in China, a minimalist opera by John Adams that was first staged in 1987. And the Scottish opera put it on in February 2020. It got rave reviews. It was nominated for a Sky Arts Award and was delighted to do it. It was nominated this June. It shows what a difference a year made. So February 2020, everybody loved this production. It was great. It sold out performance. A year later, when it got this nomination, Scottish Opera, and was proud to announce it, a British arts organization that purports to stand up for the East Asian and Southeast Asian singers and actors protested that the opera had cast white singers as Chairman Mao and Prime Minister Zhou Enlai. And the Scottish Opera, within 48 hours of having received the nomination and then getting these minimalist tweets from this Arts Beats organization, it's called, that's the acronym BEATS, British East and Asian Theater and Arts Growing. I'm not getting the actor. It had withdrawn its nomination. It had groveled, just like Juilliard said, we are so sorry for causing offense. We're withdrawing the nomination. Please give us space to consider our sins and figure out how to atone for it. The irony is that this opera by John Adams was originally staged by Peter Sellers, who's probably the most left-wing American opera director that we've got. John Adams is himself left-wing, the librettist. Alice Goodman is left-wing. Their original cast was all white, and virtually every cast of Nixon in China since then has been all white. Nobody thought to complain. Peter Sellers didn't accuse himself of cultural appropriation. John Adams did not. And yet within the last year, this has gone so fast that from now on, it is going to be virtually taboo to cast a white singer as Nixon, excuse me. Oh, and the other irony is get this, John, a black singer sang Nixon. So that was okay. And I asked this arts organization, Beats, well, why is it okay for a black singer to sing a white role, but a white singer can't sing a Chinese role? And he said, here's the test. Here's the test of art for now. It's progressive to bump out a white singer, but it's not progressive to bump out a white singer as a white character, but it's not progressive to cast a white singer as a Chinese character. So art is now all about whether you can check off the progressive, but if you've got the best singer, it doesn't matter. If that singer doesn't match a person of color identity, you can't go forward with it. It's going to make the opera unmountable because it has so many Chinese roles in it. And there's simply, outside of China, there's not going to be enough singers to fill the chorus. And there was also accused that they used makeup, stage makeup, to make the singers look more Asian. Well, now, does this mean that if you're going to play King Lear, you have to be 70 years old because we have ageism? Or if you're going to play Falstaff, you can't use a bodysuit. You have to be actually fat yourself. Or if you're going to play Richard III or Rigoletto, you can't use a bodysuit. This dumb literalism is going to make all art and all artistic performance impossible. And so it has not ended. It's going very fast, and it's going to take it all down.
Heather, we've got many, many questions, but before we go to the questions, there's two other aspects of the diversity delusion that I'd like to quickly ask you about. The first is that in it you talk about the fact that some people have claimed that what is occurring is a result of snowflake parenting, that it's because of a psychological understanding of human frailty, which is why we have such things as trigger warnings and care expressed about our language. You say this is part of the truth, but you also say what is occurring is a political project and is an ideological objective. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yes, and I'm referring there to The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, for whom I have enormous respect. But they viewed the narcissism and the self-pity on campus, the demands to shut down alleged hate speech, such as me talking about Petrarch at Bucknell or Holy Cross, as largely a psychological phenomenon growing out of the something we call here helicopter parents. Again, I never know whether you've got these phrases too.
Same in Australia.
Parents, what?
Same terminology in Australia.
Okay. That parents are being overly protective of their children who don't develop psychological resilience. And so when they come to colleges and confront ideas that they disagree with, that hate and Lukianov actually, I think, way prematurely concede or claim are actually threatening psychologically, that they have no emotional resilience for that. And so they actually propose, and this idea, as much as I respect hate and Lukianov, I find ridiculous. They propose that students, when they enter college, be given cognitive behavioral therapy as a prophylactic. We are in enough of a therapeutic culture as is. We don't need more of it. I think what's going on, yes, there's definitely psychological elements to it. And I wrote an article for City Journal on what I called the college woke spa and the therapeutic campus. But this is largely an ideological war on a civilization deemed too white and too male. And the rhetoric of hurt, of grievance, of lethal threat doesn't map up exactly with the psychological explanation, because white males are parented by the same helicopter parented as white females, and yet the claims of grievance and of being threatened by non-conforming speech is largely from whites coming from females, not so much from the white males. And Black students, on average, and I'm speaking on averages here, there's many individual exceptions, do not have that same phenomenon of helicopter parenting. And yet they are leading the charge at claiming that they are at threat of their lives. And I don't exaggerate. This is not a figure of speech. There was a group of students who occupied the president's office at Brown University, claiming that they needed to be exempt from such duties as studying for exams or showing up for exams or class because they were trying so hard to stay alive at Brown. Let me just, in case anybody doesn't know this, Brown is perfectly safe. It is, there's no safer place on a college campus, both in terms of literal physical safety and in terms of psychological safety. So this is, but they mean this quite literally. It is an ideological war driven by hatred, by people who do not want to contribute, but just want to tear things down. This is the great power that revolutionary mobs have had throughout human history. It is the power of negation. You can tear down. It is much harder to put things back up again or create ab initio.
And then flowing from that, you speak in the diversity delusion about the role of universities, and I found this very interesting. So, for example, at the Institute of Public Affairs, as you know, we've been strong advocates and supporters for freedom of intellectual inquiry and freedom of speech on many issues in campus and in schools. But you make the point that's fine as far as it goes, but we can't lose sight of the fact that universities should be imparting and teaching knowledge and truth. And I think that's an important point, which is something we do sometimes lose sight of. Can you explore that a little bit before we go to questions from IPA members?
Well, first, let me just say, John, that these are fantastic questions, and I'm incredibly honored that you read my book so carefully, and it's a testament to your leadership and your ability to absorb a wide range of ideas. And not that mine are so complicated, but thank you for bringing these questions up. Yes, what we saw in America during this, as the hysteria and the frenzy to drown out non-conforming speakers grew louder and louder and more irrational. A lot of conservatives fighting back against that embraced what amounted to the position that the very essence of universities is debate, debating opinion, teaching students to get up there and thrash things out in a way that ends up being very presentist. So we're supposed to debate, how many numbers of genders are there, and should there be trans bathrooms and whatnot, or is Trump not a fascist? Of course, there's only one answer to that. But I thought that there was too much of an emphasis on the idea of simply challenging mostly received contemporary political wisdom. John Stuart Mill, who was the great exponent, the great theorist of free speech, when he gave his inaugural lecture as the rector of St. Andrews at Glasgow University, didn't speak a bit about education as merely, debate and divided opinion. It was all substantive knowledge, mostly grounded in the classics. And so, yes, of course, students should be open to ideas, but there's a whole lot of knowledge for which the idea of debate is irrelevant. You don't debate trigonometry. You don't debate German case endings. You don't even, as a freshman, debate the causes of the spread of civilization around the Mediterranean. There are things, you don't debate the laws of thermodynamics as an undergraduate. You simply don't have knowledge to do so. So really the purpose of knowledge is to cram, of education rather, is to cram as much knowledge into the empty noggins of undergraduates as is possible in the mere 4 years available to students. And that should be understood, that there is a vast amount of greatness and beauty that awaits students, and that the time is running out. It is urgent. This may be their best opportunity to wallow in these works. And I'm not saying they should be utterly passive before them, but there should be an attitude of welcome listening. I mean, I fell in love with most of my professors because there is an eros to knowledge. They were the source of knowledge to me, and I hungered for it. Yes, I talked in class more than I should have, but nevertheless, the real purpose, as I say, as Oakeshott said, is the passing on of an inheritance of knowledge.
So, Heather, that comes in our last 10 minutes to the questions, and so many questions are exactly about what you have just said. How do we regain the ideal of passing on knowledge, the success of the human achievement, and the glories of our heritage? How do we regain that? What do we do to change the situation we're facing at the moment?
Well, first of all, we have to get rid of the faculties completely. I mean, you really need to shut down the universities, because there are very few humanities or social science faculties left that do not view their role as activists, as creating race warriors, sex warriors. They don't know anything anymore. Scholarship is dead. Study of languages for PhD students is practically non-existent. Somebody was just telling me of an English professor who said she's never read George Eliot or Trollope, and yet she's a Victorianist. It's mind-boggling. You cannot. I do not.
I find that very hard to believe that we now have professors like that.
I don't have the eloquence to say how bad things are. But I would say this, John, and again, this is difficult territory. The analysis that I have come up with in my last 4 or 5 years of battling this is that the idea that is driving everything that we need to push away from is that of systemic racism. And this seems like a jump, but it's not. Right now, the only allowable explanation for socioeconomic disparities is bias. what is taboo on college campuses and what is now taboo in the culture at large is to talk about the behavioral and cultural disparities that I believe are a much stronger explanation for ongoing socioeconomic racial disparities. You can't talk about that. And as long as racism remains the only allowable explanation, the left wins. On college campuses, that is translated into a frontal assault on Western civilization, which is seen as defined and perpetuating this systemic racism. I am not going to deny the extraordinary violation of America's ideals throughout most of our history. Up until the 1960s, whites treated blacks with the most heart-wrenching cruelty, contempt, sadism, gratuitous cruelty. But we have changed radically. And at the same time, there's most aspects of Western civilization have nothing to do with race. The scientific revolution, the scientific method, architecture, political theory do not bear on race. It is narcissism on the part of females to think it's about gender. It's narcissism on the part of different ethnic groups to think it's all about them. It's not. It's about something greater than that. But as long as racism remains the only allowable explanation, everything is coming down. As I say, it is happening in classical music. Everything is coming down. There's going to come a time when we are not allowed to perform Beethoven and Bach anymore because they were white males. I am not exaggerating. Read my Coming City Journal article on this. It's all laid out. So we have to screw up the courage to come up with alternate explanations for ongoing socioeconomic disparities. And if we don't do that, there's going to be nothing left standing. The statues, the monuments, the history, our government is coming down.
One of the questions that many of our young members have asked, our Generation Liberty members have asked is, what can they do when they're at school or at university? What can an individual student do who wants to partake of the culture of Western civilization?
Well, I hope that there is some corner of your university which will give you those books without a hate-filled political gloss. And that seems unlikely, but maybe at least try to get the books. You know, the classics now have been taken over. The classics professors are all beating their chests about how the very field is all about white colonialism, which is preposterous. But if you have a course in the Greek tragedies and Greek comedies, search it out. Search out courses in Renaissance literature, wallow in the beauties of pastoral poetry, 19th century novel. The greatest drama in human civilization is the evolution of style. How did we get from medieval romance, allegorical epic, to the 19th century realistic novel? It's mind-blowing. What happened in human consciousness and expression to open up like that? Not that there's something narrow about medieval and Renaissance allegory, but it is a profound change. How did we get from the Gregorian chant to Chopin nocturnes? This is the greatest drama we've got. Search out those works and do not be afraid. And do not be afraid.
And Heather, one of the questions we've had from a member, Mark, who's a parent, what advice would you give to parents of students going to study the humanities in the United States or Australia or somewhere else?
Well, sadly, the parents have to be educators now. One of the biggest mistakes was getting rid of core curriculum, fixed curriculum. It is the responsibility of educators to say to students, this is what you need to learn to be an educated person. They've all abdicated that responsibility. They give students 100% unfettered discretion, at least in the United States, to choose their courses. The reason students go to college, guys, is they don't know anything. They don't know enough to choose their courses. I didn't have to study history at Yale. I was at one of the greatest history departments in the country. I studied no history because Yale was so cowardly. It did not have the balls to say to me, you study American and European history. So I'm a casualty of that. Parents, you've got to step up to the plate, work out with your students what their courses are, read that course catalog carefully. You're going to have to educate yourself for the warning signals, with the isms, with the colonialism, with the, gender identity. Sometimes it's well hidden, other times it's not, but do not take a hands-off attitude. And ask your students, your children, what books are they getting assigned? If they're not getting assigned the classics, try to get them to read it in the summer. But again, they should realize that this is a precious opportunity. If you're giving your students a college education and you're paying through the nose, at least here, they should be educated.
Why have we allowed this to happen? How have parents allowed it to happen? How have governments and politicians allowed it to happen? Many members have been asking, have politicians not been looking at what's occurring? Have we rested on our laurels? Have we taken our success for granted? And many members have spoken about how all the things you've just described have happened so quickly. What do you think has occurred to get us to this situation? And then a final question that I'm going to ask Heather is, I'm going to ask you for the embers of light, the hopes for optimism into the future. But how have we got to this stage? Well,
it may be that most people actually, sadly, don't care that much about the humanities. If nobody ever hears Mozart or sees a Tiepolo fresco, maybe people don't care that much. And there's a careerism element to college now where you have parents that are, what they most care about is credentializing their child with a degree that will allow them to have bragging rights at a cocktail party and to land the great consulting job at Goldman Sachs or Bain or other, Morgan Stanley, whatever. And so I think parents have been too hands off. Have
we been too hands off as a society, as a culture to allow this to occur? Have all of us been responsible for what's occurring? Because what's occurred in the humanities has flowed through to politics, to our culture, to what we see in sports, to our civil institutions. Have we all allowed this to happen?
Well, I'm going to bring it back to the same point, John. We feel very guilty about, in the United States at least, about the treatment of Blacks. And we are worried. I view it, the elites are worried that the achievement gap and behavior gap is not going to close, which they're giving up on the idea of meritocracy, of bourgeois norms, of a single standard of behavior and accomplishment. They're for the last 50 years, they've been crafting double standards of accomplishment. You mentioned, math is racist. The right answer is racist. Promptness is racist. Rationality is racist. That's a tragic giving up of the very things that have made this culture so powerful. And so they're quickly jettisoning everything about the past because they don't have the courage to stand up for it in the face of the racial victimology narrative. So that's why I say this is the most difficult thing in our culture today to take on. But as long as the myth of bias is the only allowable explanation, the left wins. So we have to be able to say that's not what's our reality today, and the past offers jewels and riches that should not be viewed through this destructive lens of racial hatred. As far as optimism, I have to confess, I think there's optimists and pessimists by nature. It's part of your constitution. I look at optimists and think, how can you not see how bad things are? And they look at me and they say, how can you not see all the rays of hope? So I feel like, I haven't seen anything get better for the last 60 years. So it's hard to see things turning around. Nevertheless, obviously in this country now, We have some parents that are finally waking up to the poison of racial identity politics in the elementary school and high school level. Whether they will be crushed by the elites before they manage to turn this thing around, I don't know. I do sense that there are, among young students, followers of people like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro. I don't know how many they are, whether we can find a language that will make it acceptable to push back against the racial victimology narrative. That remains the question. Right now, it is an amazingly asymmetrical rhetorical playing field in politics. The mainstream media, Democratic politicians in this country, the left, constantly talk about white supremacy, white privilege, whites as the source of all evils in the world. And yet it is Republicans who are viewed as racially divisive. It's viewed as perfectly appropriate and not racially divisive to go around bashing whites all the time. The question is, are we moving towards a race war? There may come a point when whites say, okay, you're saying we are the source of all evil. You're categorizing us constantly. Well, so we'll play white identity politics as well. It's logical. It squares the circle or it circles the circle. At some point that may happen. Whether that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But right now, and it may be a good thing if it's inclusive and if it means that the majority culture is no longer going to grovel and prostrate itself before phony charges of systemic racism. The reality, John, I'm going to put it very bluntly, far from white privilege today, the reality in our institutions in the United States, at least, is Black privilege. There's not a single mainstream institution, whether it's not a university, a bank, a big tech company, a law firm, a Fortune 500 corporation, which is not twisting itself into knots to hire and promote as many minorities as possible. I suspect that's the case in Australia as well. Discrimination is not a problem. The achievement gap is the problem. That is what is standing between us and racial proportionality today, not racism.
Heather, thank you for your participation in IPA Encounters today. As long as we have people like you and your advocacy and your support and your inspiration for our culture, for our heritage, for our history, we will find a way out of this. Heather, thank you for being with us today.
John, it's been such an honor to be with IPA, and thank you for your institutional creativity and entrepreneurship in creating such an essential Australian institution. And please come and create a few more in the United States because we need you.
When we are allowed out of Australia.
Okay, please. Well, we'll have to come and save you, but I'm not going to wear my damn mask. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Heather. That concludes IPA Encounters.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for watching IPA Encounters. To participate live in the next episode of IPA Encounters, become a member of the Institute of Public Affairs. You can join online at www.ipa.org.au.